Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Women Get On Board speaker series. While everyone comes in and gets settled, we have a few tech tips for you. Please make sure to turn your cameras off and your mute on for the duration of the event. The session will be recorded, and the recording will be shared in a follow-up communication along with a feedback survey. Please feel free to use the chat function at any time throughout the session to ask a question to be answered during the Q&A portion of the event. Now I'd like to introduce Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get On Board.
Thank you, Keisha. Thank you for our tech tips. Welcome. I want to begin our Women Get On Board speaker series virtual event today by acknowledging the land in which I live is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory and is the land protected by the dish with one spoon. Wampum Agreement is directly adjacent to the Haldeman Treaty territory. Today, this is an area and is a home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important and understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. I also would like to take a moment to reflect on the current conflict in Ukraine, which is causing a humanitarian crisis with far-reaching implications. We stand together to support our community with family and friends who have been impacted deeply. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon. We're delighted to have our final speaker series, Women Get On Board speaker series before the summer. Women Get On Board is a member-based company that connects, promotes, and empowers women to corporate boards. Our goal is quite simply to get one more woman on a board, one board at a time. We are member-based and we have 800 members across Canada, so welcome our members today. Women Get On Board is delighted to be hosting this virtual event speaker series with our sponsor, Southleaf Group. They are a trusted advisor to boards in senior management with expertise developing innovative and customized people and pay programs that will enhance business results. Their breadth of their experiences, together with business strategy, financial analysis, human resources management, board governance, communication, disclosure, and investor engagement. Our topic today is trends in executive compensation and governance, and what should boards be thinking? So I have the great pleasure of introducing our speakers today. We have Amanda Voegeli. She is the president and managing partner of Southleaf Group. She has grown, after growing Canadian rewards practice over 3 years of leadership and 22 years of impactful advisory experience at Willis Towers Watson, she co-founded the Southleaf Group. She is well known and a trusted advisor to boards and management of many of Canada's largest and mid-sized companies. She uses her business acumen, her direct approach to solve business challenges, covering all matters related to pay levels, design, and governance. So Amanda is your go-to. We also are very fortunate to have her partner, Alex Pattillo, joining us today. For the past 15 years, Alex has advised boards and senior management teams on aligning pay programs with their business strategy and performance objectives. Alex has worked with many of the largest companies in Canada with international and global operations. He is known for his expertise in executive compensation, governance, including public disclosure requirements, and understanding perspectives of institutional investors and proxy advisors such as ISS and Glass Lewis in Canada. Prior to forming Southleaf, Alex worked at Willis Towers Watson. Did you two know each other before Southleaf? Coincidental. As the market leader for Toronto Rewards practice and the leader of the Canadian Executive Compensation Governance Team. So as you can see, we have an esteemed group of panelists today that have depth and breadth in the area of executive compensation and governance trends. So without further ado, I'm handing it over to you, Alex, or over to you, Amanda, and then to Alex, to both of you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. And hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us over your lunch hour. Southly is, if you're in Toronto, I should say. So Southly is pleased to be here today, and we're glad to be partnering with you. We're a big fan of yours, Deborah, and the organization that you support. So let's just jump into it. On the next slide, Keisha, thank you. This slide really is just to level set the topics and the context of what is executive compensation and governance. As you can see on the screen, I won't read you each of the words that are listed there, but the common areas of focus for boards and human resources committees can be grouped into these three categories: pay levels, pay design, and pay oversight. What we know is not listed here, but that we do usually cover and is a responsibility of the human resources and board committees, is director compensation. The title of this presentation is executive compensation, but many of the items that we review overlap with directors compensation, including peer group development and pay levels and program design. So we'll jump right back into this, and the one thing I would say about this list is that we're in a time of change, and many of you that are studying governance and the evolution of governance, thanks to Deborah and other programs, is that we're at an inflection point where mandates and responsibilities are changing. So we would note that this list presented here for oversight of human resources committees is continuing to evolve. For example, increasing focus on social topics, such as the link to ESG, CEO and senior executive succession planning, inclusion and diversity, broader workforce human capital topics. You can sort of see these are the more interesting, well, increasingly interesting and complex issues that you're going to have to deal with at the board. And so we're going to share a little bit with you on that now, but we won't have time to get into the depths of that. So maybe we just jump right in to the next slide, Keisha, and I'll hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everybody. So the first topic we're going to cover is pay levels, with, as Amanda mentioned, the different categories of topics that we cover and discuss with boards and committees. When we think about pay levels, it's expressing or helping to address how much to pay an executive, with the goal of attracting, motivating, and retaining talent. And pay levels are a reflection of an organization's pay philosophy. And what we mean by that is when designing a pay philosophy, you're addressing certain questions. What is the market for talent? How much do you need to pay within that market to attract and retain? How much will you pay when you achieve expected levels of performance? How will that be impacted if you underachieve or overachieve your defined goals? The common practice is that organizations will set pay aligned to the midpoint or median of the market when they achieve expected levels of performance. If you underpay, that would suggest you could have a retention risk. If you overpay, there's a chance you have a higher cost structure than is necessary to compete in the market. For certain roles, companies might set a different pay philosophy. So as an example, technology, engineering, data science, lately legal roles. Those certain skills that are in high demand might require an organization to pay above the median to ensure they can attract and retain. The other considerations we list on the slide when setting pay is whether you'll set pay based on current size and current scope of the organization, or do you need to be ahead of the curve and try to reflect your expected future size? Internal alignment across the executive team is also an important consideration. While you need to be mindful of what pay levels are for a certain role, you also want to make sure that there's internal equity within the organization. And the other comment we make is more trying to mitigate an unintended consequence, which is incentive programs and benefits and pension, they're usually anchored to salary. So if you are to make a salary increase, there could be a flow-through impact to the other compensation elements, which might be unintended. On the right, we show some market data for CEOs and CFOs of the TSX 60 in 2021 and 2020, so the last couple years. And this is showing disclosed actual total direct pay, so the sum of salary and incentives. And in this case, we're showing where the person is the same in the role for both years, and all data is in Canadian dollars to try to normalize for any inputs in the change. And what the data showed is that in 2021, CEO median pay was up 20% and CFO pay was up 18%. And when we saw these, this gave us pause because This was the second year of a global pandemic. We were surprised to see this level of pay increase. When we looked deeper into the data, it wasn't salary or long-term incentives that drove this change. It was the annual incentive that caused the increase. So as boards, when you're looking at this type of information, the questions you might ask are, does that pay level align with the performance that was realized? Is this a reflection of strong operating results during a period of uncertainty? Or perhaps it could have been that boards were setting a bit softer performance measures at the start of 2021 after the first year of the pandemic. Other questions that the boards might ask as they interpret market data would be, what is the pay philosophy and how does that align with the strategy? And where should executive pay, in this case, CEO and CFO pay, be positioned within this range of data to ensure that you can attract and retain? So Amanda, if you think about your clients across size of company and industry, how do you see pay philosophies differ?
Well, Alex and the audience, I think I'm sure has been exposed to comp philosophies and would understand where you're coming from in terms of that many of them do suggest that they want to target the median or the middle of their defined peer groups when they're establishing comp philosophies. But maybe I'd share a couple of different examples where just to sort of showcase that there are different ways to approach comp philosophy. So the first interesting example is that we find with some technology companies these days that they're being innovative when it comes to their approaches, much like their business models and their businesses. They're not just following the pack in this. And so what we find is that a number of these tech organizations, particularly pre-IPO private companies, where they're finding that they're choosing to not have an annual incentive component. They don't like the 1 year outlook of hooking their pay to only 1 year increments of success. And so what they do in those instances is they, of course, still need to be competitive. So what they do is they target their pay, their salaries at the median of the competitive market median, or higher, frankly, sometimes, of the total cash. So they include the bonus basically in the salary, and they have to target high against salaries, but at median against total cash. So that can be a little bit complicated. The other thing that technology companies are doing these days, because of the crazy market for talent out there, in particular for engineering staff or product developers, is that they're choosing to pay or target their equity portion of the pay package at the 75th percentile, which overall would put them somewhere between the 50th and 75th percentiles on a total compensation basis. So that's quite unique, but it's happening more often than you think in technology companies, and there may be other organizations that believe in that philosophy as well. So on another extreme end, and many of you on the call work for not-for-profit organizations potentially. Not-for-profit organizations, of course, don't have elements of pay such as bonuses or long-term incentives. So there's a lot of focus on making sure that the salary is at least at median, because you're acknowledging that there isn't a necessary pay for performance component. And with no bonus, sometimes you also focus on having higher benefits or pension values. So there's lots of different levers to make sure you're taking a look at component by component, not just that the overall package is positioned somewhere. You'll also note that based on some of the examples I gave you, that the way in which you want to target your programs has a lot to do with what you think the purpose of each pay element is and where that fits into the talent value proposition, which just means you're articulating what is the role of compensation among all the reasons why an employee might come to work for your organization. So moving on to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about market trends with respect to short-term incentive plan design. And there's been a slow evolution to the design into this place where many of the programs represent scorecards of key metrics, including both financial and non-financial, quantitative and qualitative measures. And given that we're talking on this slide about the assessment and pay or reward system for 1 year of performance, it's important that the organization take a step back to see what is needed or expected to be accomplished within the year. There's usually reflection on what you have told your shareholders is possible from a financial perspective, but also in all likelihood, you have key messages and priorities at your organization that relate to your operations, your employees, your customers, and frankly, these days around the, what your position is on how you're going to impact the world as it relates to ESG. So this hot topic, of course, of ESG is around what are the key measures that we want to focus on that we can impact on ESG? And where do we want to link them to our compensation program, if at all? How much emphasis do we need on it? And where does it fit in? Does it fit in the short-term plan or does it better fit into the long-term plan? So the chart on the right here summarizes prevalence and average weight for the metrics used in short-term incentive plans by the S&P TSX 60 companies. It's not surprising to see that it is dominated by financial metrics, such as profit, which represents on average 50% of annual incentives. But you'll see to the right, there's a mix of other financial measures and other measures in general, whereby such items as cash flow or revenue, expense management might also be included at a lower weight, something like 20 or 30%. Individual performance, you'll note, is also on there, continues to be an important part of incentives with a minority weighting. And in the boardroom, what we're seeing around incentive design and individual is the specific link to strategy execution in terms of what can this one person deliver that will ensure that there is strategic execution of whatever is important to the organization. So also increasing focus on behaviors, I would suggest. So the corporate scorecards and financial metrics can become quite obvious when you look at the strategy of an organization, but it's this sort of last 20% of individual sort of acknowledgement that there is more focus on that link to strategy, what a person can do, but also how they're behaving. And the behavior assessment that is often contained in the individual component is getting to organizations' desire to enhance culture, include a more diverse or inclusive environment, that people are now putting the money where their mouth is, and they're actually including it in the way they assess the incentive plan. So other questions that should be asked around incentive plans that as a director you need to be asking is, picking the measures is one thing, calibrating how much to pay for threshold, target, and maximum levels of performance is critical. So asking lots of hard questions of management in terms of how has the target been developed? What does the budgeting system look like? Because usually targets equal budget, financial budgets. But then how do we decide how far off of target we're willing to pay anything and how much they need to exceed target in order to justify a 2x bonus? Questions about how do these targets relate to your peers? Are you going to be embarrassed if someone can see what you paid for what level of performance? And what mechanisms are in place to use judgment or discretion? Because you as a board member ultimately will have the ability to take a step back and decide, does this payout align with what we expected the performance to be? So Alex, we saw a lot of market volatility in the last couple of years due to the pandemic, of course. Maybe you could share with the audience a little bit about some lessons that we learned.
Yeah, if I think about the experiences that organizations had, a few observations come to mind. The first is when we think about the years leading up to COVID, and now I guess it's in hindsight, we found that the short-term incentive plans were largely formulaic in their mechanics. So you would have high weight on financial results, or you might have other measures that were quantitative by nature, and they would present a range of performance objectives, and the scorecard was largely formulaic in outcome, and a little less discretion or judgment being applied in the evaluation of that performance. It took a global pandemic, hopefully once in a lifetime, but a significant event to illustrate that boards and committees do need to have that flexibility to assess performance and recognize employee contributions that are not necessarily going to be reflected in one-year financial results. So that would mean normalizing for one-time events where companies may have significantly overperformed expectations if you were in the grocery space, or underperformed expectations if your businesses were closed. So having the board apply judgment in evaluating how performance goals were set and then making fair assessments of performance and pay levels was critical during the pandemic. Going forward, I think we're going to see organizations give thought to as you say, the mechanisms for applying that board judgment and discretion. The tricky part is that when making those smart decisions, it means that companies are going to have to be thoughtful in how they disclose the rationale that was applied, which is perhaps a little harder than the prior design, which was formulaic and easier to explain numbers, as opposed to presenting the qualitative feedback on how decisions were made. I guess another lesson learned was this idea of balance, and we're starting to see it in some of the weights across the different measures. Again, prior to COVID, there was significant emphasis, or in some cases, sole emphasis on financial results. And that's important to ensure plans are affordable, and financial results, you could argue, are an outcome of all the good things that an organization is doing. I think going forward, and lessons learned from the pandemic has been that there's interest to include measures and communicate measures to both investors and employees, that there's other drivers of performance that are important. It's not just about the financials. So as you noted, customer, employee, broader communities, if you're in a resource industry, as well as all the topics related to ESG that are priorities for an organization. Companies are striving to include those measures within their broader scorecard. So Keisha, maybe we'll move on to the next design topic, which is the long-term incentive plan. So this is where, when we say long-term, this refers to programs that extend beyond 1 to 2 years. So 3 years or longer than 3 years. And what we're presenting on the slide are the different vehicles that we typically see within Canada, as well as in the US, with some nuanced differences. I'll spend a minute just to go through each of these, and we are going to be sharing these slides after to give you a chance to go through some of the details. When we think about a restricted share unit plan, or RSU plan, or for private organizations, restricted cash, this is referring to a full value plan. So the value of 1 unit is equivalent to the value of 1 share that's traded in the market. So it does track the share price of the organization. It vests after granting an RSU, it vests based on time only. And typically that's at the end of 3 years or over 3 years. So say at the end of year 1, 2, and 3. When it vests, it will be paid out in cash, or companies will issue equity or purchase equity on the market to deliver that to the participant. And at that time of vesting, the employee would pay income tax. The performance share unit is the same as the RSU, the similar features. The difference is in the vesting. So in addition to time vesting, performance share units will also set a level of performance that's required for vesting. And so if that performance is achieved, all units would vest. If performance is below or above expectations, then there would be less or more PSUs granted, or vesting and received. So the purpose of the PSU plan is also to motivate and retain executives, but it also creates a performance-based program, which is the preference of investors. They're focused on not only ensuring that executives stay and contribute to the business strategy, but also that the organization achieves the defined performance measures that align with that strategy. The last vehicle that we often see is stock options. And on this one, we refer to it as an appreciation plan because the value of the share price needs to increase from the grant date in order for there to be value in the plan. The options also vest based on time, but there's also usually a longer time horizon to realize value, say up to 5, 7, or 10 years. And at the time that a participant decides to exercise the option, they receive new shares, and the employee would historically have received a preferred tax treatment similar to capital gains. But as you may know, there was a recent change to the way that stock options are being taxed. So for example, for larger organizations and senior executives, it's now being taxed as a employment income, similar to RSUs and PSUs. The reason that's noteworthy is because we thought that was going to have an impact on perhaps the prevalence or the weight on stock options. And so we've been monitoring the market to understand what would the change do in terms of use of RSUs and PSUs and the mix of these vehicles. On the bottom two rows, you can see the 2021 stats, which are showing that prevalence for restricted share units and stock options are largely unchanged year over year. So 52% of the TS660 granted RSUs, 64% granted options. It was the PSUs where we're seeing a greater prevalence. 93% of the TS660 granted last year. That's up almost 10 percentage points. When we look across the mix, there were no change to the stock options, a little less weight on RSUs, and that was offset by a higher weight on PSUs. So as we share all this information, as the board and committee would be, if they're trying to design a long-term incentive plan, some of the questions that you would ask are, over what performance period are we trying to measure results and reward participants? If it was over 3 years, you might lean towards an RSU and PSU. If it's a longer time horizon, you might lean towards a stock option, or perhaps what we typically see is a balance of the different vehicles. There's also this notion of risk and reward. As you can appreciate, something that is time vesting has less risk, something that is tied to performance conditions has more risk, and with that risk, you would anticipate higher reward. And then finally, the questions you would ask is, what's preferred by executives and investors and proxy advisors? Because you want to ensure that the plan is motivating and valued. So man, as you see this information and look at the trends from last year, as we look forward, what do you anticipate seeing in 2023 and beyond?
Well, we do believe that there's a continuing role for options. And as you can see, based on the statistics you just read us, there wasn't a big flock away from options yet, and not specifically, surely, for the change in tax, which many organizations and people were anticipating. So it's probably will still continue to change and evolve over time, but that's sort of the first thing I would say. And the reason why we think that there is a role for options is some of the things you said. They're the vehicle that most reinforces share price growth, because as you said, they're worth nothing if the share price doesn't go up from the time of grant. They're also more levered. And what I mean by levered is that you get more of them. You'd get 2 for every 1 share, or every 1 share meaning 1 PSU or 1 RSU. And I'm saying 2 for 1, but in some organizations, it can be as high as 5 or 6 for 1. Depending on the option valuation. So these things can really focus executives on share price if that's what you're desiring. You also, as you said, get longer term alignment, because as you said, and on the slide it says, most of these other vehicles restrict themselves, I'll say, to 3 years, whereas option plans are the ones that go to the 5, 7, 10. If you didn't have an option plan, you most likely are giving out long-term incentive that only reflects 3 years of performance, which isn't actually long-term, it's midterm. So there's that as well. There's no target setting required. It's very complicated. This is probably why Alex and I have a job, is because it's very complicated to set targets under the performance share unit, as an example. What is the measure? How do you calibrate it? Like I was talking about with the short-term plan, you need to set thresholds, targets, and maximums every year that you make grants under these programs. Another aspect that organizations like about options is it's fixed. It's a fixed expense. It doesn't vary as your share price goes up and down. You actually know what you're going to book after you've granted the option. So that's helpful from a finance perspective. That said, we do think that there's going to be some focus on how options are designed and how they fit into the total package of pay. Some organizations have options that do only have 5-year vesting, and they should maybe look to elongating them to 7 or 10 years. There's this concept also of a post-exercise hold. So the biggest scrutiny of an option is that you can time the market. And if you're an executive, you can exercise when the value is high and take your money and run. That isn't the objective of an option. The option is actually to exercise and hold the share. So if you force the executive to hold the share with something like a post-exercise hold, which is just a requirement that the person who exercised the option needs to hold the underlying share for, say, a year. it absolutely negates any negative sort of feedback you would get from that number one sort of scrutiny of an option. We also think we're going to see higher share ownership requirements of senior executives. It's sort of a tit for tat. I'm going to let you have the ability to have an option, which has that great leverage, etc. But I do expect you to hold them. You know, you decide how you get your ownership levels to a significant amount of your wealth, but I do expect you to hold shares in the company. I guess the other one, taking a step back at your sort of three vehicles you've articulated on the screen, is that we would say over the past 5 years or even longer, because we've both been doing this for so long, if you went back 15 years, there was a lot of options. If you went back 15 or 20 years, the percentage of companies that had options would be 100, and the weight of the options would be 80 or 90%. So, you know, this has been a very slow evolution. If you looked at the slide last year or the year before, it looks similar to this. It feels boring, but it's a very slow de-risking of the portfolio of long-term incentive vehicles. And what I mean by de-risking is the average vesting period is getting shorter. Within the PSU plans, there's a move towards having more than one performance indicators, which diversifies the potential outcome, right? As soon as you have more measures and you score low on one and high on the other, your average is one. So there's been quite a few movements towards that. You also noted a slight increase to restricted share units. Those again are very low risk reward in their profile. And lastly, I would say there's an opportunity to create a better balance between this risk and leverage. So we do think, as I said before, maintaining some use of stock options, particularly given the dynamics with the performance units, which are being heavily used, as you can see there. PSUs have a 2x upside, which with the compounding of a share price and a 2x of the number of units, actually can start looking like an option. So we've replaced them with performance share units because they are good governance and they drive specific performance. But in fact, it operates similar to an option in terms of how much value it can deliver. So we do think now is the time to take a careful look at the design of performance share units, minimize the number of measures, make sure that the measures you pick, either absolute measures of performance or relative measures of performance, are meaningful and aligned with your desired risk profile and strategic objectives. And finally, the one thing, this is quite complicated, but I'd be remiss to not mention it, is that my favorite plan design consideration is to morph what is most Canadian companies have stock option plans. And we continue to work with organizations, and you as a board member need to ask this question: why is that a stock option plan? And a stock option plan is sets aside new equity that is going to dilute existing shareholders, but it doesn't have to be in the form of an option. What you're saying is you want to set aside a pool of shares to be delivered to executives. What we kind of plant with you all is asking management the question about, shouldn't our option plan be more flexible? Shouldn't it allow for us to grant options or shares? And the number one reason why you want your plans to have that is for ultimate flexibility. And the ultimate flexibility is that those restricted shares, as an example, could then go past 3 years of horizon. So it's a bit of a loophole in the Income Tax Act, or the Tax Act, whereby you would be able to have a restricted share, not option, vest to an executive in year 4, 5, 6, it frankly could go 15 years if you really wanted to. So I just leave you with that as, again, sort of interesting trend and evolution of long-term incentives and the mix. So moving on, Keisha, to the next slide. It's our last sort of heavy one, and then we'll move on to the questions. Thanks for posting those there. Is on governance of pay. So we see, as an example on the right-hand side, Say on Pay continues to be very supported by Canadian companies, despite the fact it is voluntary. And in fact, the majority of even mid-capped publicly traded companies also have Say on Pay, which we were sort of surprised to see. We hadn't looked at it for a while, and we took a look, and it's the majority. It's in the 90s in terms of percent of even mid-sized companies that are publicly traded that have this. And again, what you're doing with say on pay is the shareholders are voting on if they believe in the executive compensation program and that it is supportive of pay performance. So it's not only reserved for large cap companies anymore. It originally started out, of course, with the banks and others adopting it, but now it's quite widely adopted. And it's not surprising also, if you look at that graphic, that there was a slight dip in 2021 to 90% average support, given some of the scrutiny around the pandemic pay decisions, but it's come back up again. So other governance tools and processes we see regularly these days is modernizing the committee charter. So again, this is something, if you're on a board or on a committee, falls squarely in your responsibility of taking a look at it and seeing what it says. We do see that now boards and committees are overseeing and governing topics such as diversity, human capital, and ESG priorities. It is taking up a lot of the board's time right now to decide and figure out where the best place to house those decisions and oversight. So you are going to, play an important role in that. Share ownership is increasingly a topic of interest as well. There's more requests of managements to hold real shares rather than phantom shares, and to truly ensure that there is alignment with the shareholder experience. As an example, there's rules popping up around what portion of the ownership guidelines the executive must hold in real shares. For example, I have one client that suggests that at least a third of the ownership level should be in real shares, not outstanding equity or LTI. Some other topics are listed here around clawbacks and anti-hedging. Those have been around for a long time. So you as a board member should be asking, if we don't have it, why don't we have it? And it's something to look into. And finally, I would suggest external disclosure has been enhancing over the years. It's been changed from a legal document, the proxy, to one more of telling your story. And you, if you're ever the chair of a human resources or compensation committee, often get to write your own soliloquy letter on, why you do what you do, why you believe strongly in the way in which the programs have been designed, and why you believe that the pay outcomes align with what you as the board see as performance, either good or bad. So Alex, if I go back to say on pay, maybe you could talk a little bit to the folks about what is a low say on pay vote. This all looks really rosy, but there are examples of low pay say on pay votes. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience with what is that, and how do you respond if that's where you end up?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this can be answered in a few different ways. If you think about, well, what does a failed say on pay vote mean? That effectively means less than 50% of the shareholders that vote on say on pay are saying that they disagree with the approach that the company has taken on setting pay levels, making pay decisions, the quality of disclosure. So you at least want to get 51% of the shareholder vote to say that you passed say on pay. But if you ask a typical organization, they, I think, will be disappointed if they get a score less than 90%, or if there's a material decrease year over year. So a company that had 95% in one year, if they get a 90 the next year, I think they're going to be frustrated because they're going to want to know which investors changed their vote and for what reasons. If you ask proxy advisors, so we've referred to them a couple of times, ISS or Glass Lewis, these are the advisors that write reports that help to inform institutional investors on how to vote on say on pay. ISS and Glass Lewis would say if a company receives less than 80% score, that should trigger change. And change could mean the committee revisiting the programs or collecting feedback from investors to provide a response in the following year's disclosure. So I guess the takeaway is you're striving for above 90%. If you get less than 80%, it's likely going to result in some degree of action. And that's what investors are going to be focusing on the following year in the disclosure. If we think about how do companies respond in the case of a lower say on pay or failed say on pay vote, again, this will vary. Some companies will say, well, this isn't a reaction to executive pay programs. There's a view that sometimes say on pay is more about a say on strategy, or it's a say on climate, or perhaps it was just a one-time event and in future years we won't make the same decisions and therefore investors will support us. Others, and I think we would say this falls in the better governance camp and is more typical, they would say we want to know what investors are frustrated about and we want to collect their feedback. So that could be through an investor survey, or more typically, we're seeing organizations identify their top 10 investors, or the percentage of the number of investors that represent a meaningful percentage of the outstanding shares, and having individual meetings with those investors. And it's not always the purpose to address the specific issues that an investor has raised, but more to mutually understand where the investor sees some criticism, or perhaps where the investor can be educated on the rationale for the pay programs or the decisions made. And so the outcome of that experience is that organizations that have perhaps had a lower vote or failed say on pay, if you look now at their compensation calendar, it's very typical to have shareholder engagement as an annual part of the process.
Thanks, Alex. And continuing on with governance, I wondered, Alex, if you had any client stories that you can share where the governance processes went wrong and help everyone understand where that can happen.
Yeah, I won't name names, but we have been involved over the years after an organization received that lower or failed say on pay vote. And I guess a common theme is, again, back to that misunderstanding. Perhaps the investor doesn't understand the pay programs, or perhaps the company doesn't understand the investor perspectives. And so the experience has been that in these circumstances, there's an education process on both sides, and the importance is to have this meeting between the company and the investors to better understand each other. Oftentimes we'll hear companies be frustrated with proxy advisors, ISS or Glass Lewis, because they'll say these organizations don't understand us or our industry, or the evaluations are black box and too standardized. And the feedback we would say is, well, you can just remove them from the equation by having a good engagement with your investors. And if you have that open dialogue and you're having those meetings during periods of success and strong performance, as opposed to just waiting until there's a concern, it allows for a better ongoing relationship.
Thanks, Alex. So that is our last slide, and I see we already have a few questions that we'll tackle, but anyone who wants to add to the chat with additional questions, and I'll loop back also with a couple of clarifying ones that are posted there. So I'll start with the clarifying one. So when we're talking in the slides today, we are over geared to CEO and CFO, but the principles of incentive design, both on the annual incentive and the long-term incentive, are the same ones that we would suggest you think about for all of the executives. And then how does the program cascade throughout the organization is sort of the next series of questions that we ask and you as a board should ask, because there should be alignment, and we're just sort of starting at the top in order to sort of build the right infrastructure, but then you'd cascade it. And so as an example, on the annual incentive plan design, this is overgeneralizing, that corporate scorecard that's developed with the financial and non-financial metrics is often the same applied throughout the organization, but what changes is the weighting of corporate score outcomes on the annual plan, and more emphasis is given to the individual weighting. In our example there, we said 10 to 20% was for the CEO's individual performance. As you get more junior, you'd see that individual weighting go up, and at the most junior levels, you'd see it be as high as 50%, or it's up to you. But as an example, it goes from 10% at the CEO all the way down to 50% weight on an individual, and sometimes it's more simple than that, but as an example. And the other one to sort of highlight is the long-term incentive mix of those three vehicles: RSUs, PSUs, and stock options. Again, overgeneralizing, but just to give you some comments on how does this cascade to everyone else, is that options are increasingly very restricted to the CEO and direct reports. So when we're giving those percentages, those are the percentage weightings, those would be for the named executive officers, the top five officers. And what happens is as you go more junior, again, it's the weighting of the 3 vehicles that adjusts based on span of control, ability to influence those high level performance outcomes. And basically, again, options for the most senior people, then it becomes a mix of restricted share units and performance share units if you have both programs, whereby the more junior you are, the more likely you are to get restricted share units. And by junior, I mean eligibility stops at, say, a director or a VP level, depending on the size of the organization. So more restricted share units, which are way more straightforward and less performanced, offers that retention tool for that level of executive without, overkill. So that's just some comments around how to apply some of this information throughout the organization. It does apply. There was a question earlier on about retention and what we're seeing in terms of trends around retention programs, and perhaps how do you use long-term vehicles or deferrals. And retention, I'd say, just to answer that one specifically, is I think we just, because there's so many situations around that, is I give you some principles. And so there's a couple of buckets of things we suggest you look at when you're looking at retention. One is who is eligible. So how critical are these people? Why are they critical? Are there different definitions of criticality? Is there a range of criticality in terms of how you bucket who might be eligible for a retention program? The second question we'd ask you is, for how long are they critical, or for how long do you need to retain them? Because the longer you need to retain them, the higher the quantum of the retention award. And then I'd say meaningfulness of the retention award. It can be scaled to how much money they make, basically. And so we often see them calibrated as a percentage of salary, being as high as 100 or 200% of salary in very senior, very exceptional circumstances, but usually something less than 100% of salary, but depending on the horizon. And the number one rule about retention is it can't be linked to performance, because by its very nature, it's not retentive if there's some chance it's not going to be earned. Of course, time would be the restriction, but not performance. So just a few things for you to think about on that. Alex,
yeah, I can.
These two?
yeah, I can jump in on in order. So there was a question on the tools the boards use to measure the impact of pay models. I'm trying to think about tools specifically. If I think about the indicators of whether the program is having the impact, I mean, one that first comes to mind is it retaining executives and motivating executives? So if you're seeing turnover and attrition on a program that you thought was retentive, then that's not aligning with the desired objective of the program. The other was alignment with investor experience. So in situations where the share price is up, but the pay outcomes are high, that would suggest misalignment and something is perhaps broken in the program. So oftentimes the tools or analytics that we're looking at are to ensure that pay outcomes are aligned with the achievement of performance results and the experience of investors. And what's perhaps a little confusing is if you're opening up a proxy, a disclosure, the elements of the pay that are presented reflect different time periods. Salary is pretty straightforward. Annual bonus is looking back because it's showing what the actual amount was paid for the performance that was provided in that year. The long-term incentive represents the grant value. So it's the value that can be achieved over time if performance and share price reach expected levels. And so the analysis that we'll do is looking at, we said that we were trying to deliver X dollars. What was the actual amount of compensation realized over time? And what was the shareholder returns over that same time period to test alignment? And then finally, it's just a more qualitative view of, have we executed on our business strategy and was that program aligned?
Yeah, good ideas. So this last one posted says, talk about the kinds of items that you're seeing in HRCs building into their guidelines for the use of discretion. It's a very good question, and it definitely varies in terms of how how much formality and what guidelines are even written down. The historical approach to discretion, as everyone probably knows, it's written into every plan design. And if it's not written in, it needs to be written in. It's ultimately the board has discretion to do whatever it wants, despite a formulaic outcome of a pay program, be it zero and you need to pay them something to keep them, or that you feel like it's too high given the scenario and if experience of the shareholders or the employees, you can knock it down. But we do see a hesitancy of board members for good reason that they don't want to just arbitrarily make these decisions. So definitely a lot of work going into it. One thing that I'd say that sort of helps board members think about it differently is, instead of thinking about it as using discretion, we started using this word informed judgment, 2 words. You know, you're not just arbitrarily making discretion even by its nature sounds like you're just like making willy-nilly decisions. This is based on the board's informed judgment of this makes sense or this doesn't make sense, or that outcome isn't correct. So what we see written down sometimes now a little bit more than before is on adjustments to financials, as an example, because that happened a lot coming out of COVID. Is like we had to adjust for COVID expenses. We had to adjust for whatnot within the actual financial objectives. So we see a little bit more clarity in terms of it has to be material, it has to be something outside of management's control. So a couple of like more principle-based objectives or items that you would consider or not consider come to mind for me. And the other one would be baskets of things that are not explicitly recognized within the incentive plan itself. So it's dependent on your organization, your industry, but what are those things that are not explicitly identified in the annual or long-term incentive plan that are bigger than that? And usually they do need to be exceptional, extraordinary events or items, but more and more, you're right, organizations are writing them down so that, again, there's a clarity for external parties like shareholders, but also internally for management. They also need to understand at what point you might use your discretion or your informed judgment. Alex, I don't know if you have any other ones.
Yeah, well, I was just maybe adding to that, and then Florence, we see your hand up, is the comment back from a board member one time that resonated with me was that it's very easy in some ways to set performance goals that align with our strategy and that need to be achieved over the year. But the power of flexibility and discretion is to recognize the things that were unexpected and how management has responded to those. And so, as we know, you can't write those down at the start of the year. You have to proceed through the year for those to arise. So I think that's, again, the power of discretion. So Florence, do you have a question? I think you might be on mute.
Technical difficulties, or feel free to type it in.
Yeah, in the chat.
It might be easier, Florence. So any other questions?
I can take the director compensation question, or at least to start. It's a good question because you're right, we didn't cover it specifically in the slides, but it is a topic of interest and something that we consult on. The sort of foundational items are similar in the sense that you want to develop a philosophy for board pay. So who are you competing for director talent? Where do you want to set pay levels within that market? What are the different pay elements that you'll provide as part of total direct compensation? Historically, the pay elements would have been a retainer, similar to a salary. There also would have been per meeting fees. So if you attend a board meeting, it's $1,000. If you attend a committee meeting, it's another $1,000. If you, before virtual meetings, if you called in by telephone to the meeting, it would be $500 per meeting. But and then the third element was an equity grant, an equity retainer, and that was in a deferred share unit plan. So similar to an RSU, but it has a longer time horizon with the intention that you're trying to align director compensation with a longer shareholder experience, and you can't access that value until you leave the board. The trend has been that board compensation is moving more to what we're referring to an all-in retainer So it still has the cash retainer, it still has the equity retainer, but companies are moving away from this idea of per meeting fee for attendance at a meeting. There's just an expectation that if you're a director, you're going to be participating, you're going to be prepared, you're going to attend the meetings. And so therefore we don't need this variable component to the pay program. I guess the other slight change is the frequency of pay increases for directors. We tend to see those reviews happen every 2 or 3 years. And when those reviews happen, there's increases, 5, 10, 15% to make sure that you're aligning to market, but it's not as if we're seeing annual increases in the same frequency that we might see with executive pay. Anything to add there, Amanda?
No, that's perfect. I mean, I think the other thing about pay levels with directors is becoming a hot topic, which data is always delayed because the place you get director data is public disclosure. So it's always outdated by the time it's printed. And I think, I mean, if we were to forecast the future, I think we would say there's going to be pressure on upward increases to directors' compensation because of how much directors have had to deal with and how the role is evolving. Like we alluded to in updating and modernizing the mandate, it's become very broad. You know, even gone are the days of the compensation committee. They are now human resources and people committees. And with that comes a lot more responsibility, which, you know, the kinds of questions that it's better, of course, for future governance, but the questions you get to ask the company now are way broader, and your need to understand what's going on all talent questions becomes higher. So there's increasing workload, there's increasing scrutiny of board members because of the complex nature of the questions being asked. So I do think that board pay might come up. It's not gonna come up right now because everyone's still looking at the consequences of COVID and business is tough and people's lives are tough. So there's not a lot of appetite yet, but when things get better, I do think there might be some pressure on pay levels. Good questions popping up in here. Okay, independence of the board advisor. So truly independent from management. We would say that we do, you know, we as example love to give our advice to the board. We think that we're giving the independent advice, we're giving our best advice in the interest of the company is the way in which we position it. We don't mind working with management. So I'm glad you're asking that question, which is if my advisor is working with management to come up with proposals and present them to the board, how do I know that they're not being biased in any way? And the historical concern around biases has been with multi-service firms, meaning like the integrated HR consulting businesses that sell risk brokering or they sell pension actuarial services to the same company, and there's millions of dollars of consulting at risk. So it's definitely a theoretical problem, I can assure you, because both Alex and I worked at Willis Towers Watson, which was that, and we gave our same independent advice when we worked at Willis Towers Watson, an integrated organization, as we do now as an independent boutique. Our independent boutique cannot give pension actuarial services, so we by default don't have any other client revenue at risk. We just need to give the best advice to the board and the company as it relates to executive and director and governance. So protocols are things like independent meetings with your advisor without management present. Should absolutely be happening every time. Having pre-meetings with you as the committee chair and your independent advisor before getting in the room to resolve any potential conflicts of interest or conflicts. It just allows you both to speak more freely about the potential for this to come up and how it's being resolved. Year-end assessments, ask your management team, ask your board how the independent advisor is doing, give them that feedback. I'd say is some of them, as well as protocol, if you do happen to have a multi-service organization, ask for transparency on the client relationship and how many fees are going to which advisor within those multi-service firms. So easy ways to just sort of make sure there's an administrative practice to govern it, because that's, again, you're governing that. Looks like we're out of time, Deborah. Deborah's back.
That's like the cane taking you off the stage. Okay. Great questions, great discussions. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Amanda, for sharing your passion and your insights on executive compensation. And I like that you use the term modern governance. the trends that are going forward and staying current as a director and knowing what these trends are. So I think you covered a lot of ground. We will be sharing the slides, so thank you for sharing that. We like to donate to our charity partner for your time today, and our charity partner is Dress for Success Toronto chapter. So we want to thank Southleaf Group for being our sponsor for today, and for Amanda and Alex for giving us such great insights. I know we'll have continued dialogue, and Alex, I think you did a great job of kind of framing up director comp in just a very short order, but those are the trends I'm seeing. So maybe we'll have a continued dialogue on another speaker series. No commitment from you, but lots of interest. I hope you can join us. For everyone on this session today, you will receive a link later. You'll receive a thank you email, and in it will be a feedback survey. So we'd love to hear from you. I know Alex and Amanda will love to hear from you as well. Also, you'll receive a recording in the next few days, so stay tuned. Just to let you know, our next speaker series is scheduled for September 28th, where UBS Investments will be sponsoring a 3-part series on ESG. And on September 28th, we will focus on the E of the ESG. So stay tuned. That will be in your follow-up. Thank you. And just want to say happy summer to all of you. See you in September. Thank you. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.